And now, we have one more thing left for this morning. Benno is one of my favorite people at the conference. I once described him as the kindest and most empathetic asshole troll I've ever met.
That effect.
Words to that effect. That was your Twitter bio for like a year, I think.
I wear it as a badge of pride.
He does. But he is lovely. He has some ideas about ideas, and shockingly, he's going to talk about them for 45 minutes. Please make that Benno feel welcome with the terrifying longevity of ideas.
I think I just got one question before I start. How does this all work again? Anyway, so yes, my God, I am on a thing again. It's I worked out just before. It's been about, I think, 3.5 years since I've been up here, and so just before I get started, I'd just really like to thank Daisy and Lily and everyone else involved for giving me the opportunity to get back on my bullshit. I will say before I start, I do have a couple of content warnings. I will be discussing the COVID-19 pandemic, but in very general terms. I will also be discussing culture war issues, so including hate speech. I'm trying not to get too deep into it, but yeah, if that's too much for you, I absolutely do not mind if you decide that you need to be somewhere else for a bit. And the other thing that I'll say is I'm not an expert in a lot of things. I'm an expert in some things. I know a lot about other things. But I think that it's wise to sort of take to heart a thing that Tom Eastman once said about me, which is that, you know, he sees me as someone whose judgment he trusts, but whose words he does not. And that's partly because I am, as Daisy described me, a troll to some extent. But also, you are free to come up with your own ideas about ideas and all this kind of stuff, but, you know. The other thing is I did tweet, or toot, this slide. I unfortunately deleted it, but I just wanted to share it with everyone because I thought it was really cool. Anyway, so this talk started with a phrase that got stuck in my head once when I was thinking about a different talk idea, which is that ideas have a shape and the shape lingers. Which sounded cool, and you know, as with all these things, it sort of took up residence in my head, and I sort of understood what I was getting with it, but I figure I should explain it to everyone else first. So we can start with the first bit, but I think we even need to start with the first part of that even. So I could do the usual shtick of putting up a dictionary definition or a Wikipedia screenshot or something, but the thing with ideas is that they fall into one of those, you know, I knows it when I sees it kind of categories where the response to someone trying to put words around it to define it is to squirm and escape and go and gallivant off somewhere else in abstract philosophical thought land. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to define an idea as an abstraction, because abstractions are things that, you know, as people who are involved in tech, we understand. You know, we create a thing, we take a thing, we create a representation of it, and then we come up with a way to realize that in software or whatever else. But the thing with abstractions is that they're definitionally not complete. They're simplified or idealized or whatever. You know, some or all of the detail or nuance is gone because part of the point is that we don't want to have them in our head all the time because they just don't fit. You know, I can't speak to your brain, but I know that mine can't hold all of reality all in it all at once. Not that I've tried, but you know, I know that when I'm trying to hold even a moderately complicated system in my head, it can get pretty tricky. You know, ask anyone who's interrupted me while I'm trying to debug something. And so, you know, you naturally try to smooth things down and simplify them to the bits that you need, the bits that you consider important. And one of the most obvious things that we come across as, you know, techies, software types, whatever, is an API. And the most common way you see this is, you know, it's an expression of the important parts of a piece of software by virtue of it being the way you're supposed to interact with it. You know, some things are made easy, other things are made harder, other things are notionally impossible. Some things are obvious, some things are hidden, some things are documented, most aren't. some abstractions make hard things easy, some make easy things hard. Some are vital, some are whatever. But all of them express something about not only the world, at least the bit of it they're concerned with, but often something about the people that made them or the context they were made in at the time. And the other thing about APIs is that they're composable, in theory. You can put them together to make bigger things, things that then take on their own complexities and also may need to be simplified. So that you can then reason about whatever part of the system needs work at that point. And so you build abstractions around abstractions, built out of abstractions, and it all just gets abstract. Until it doesn't. Because somewhere underneath all of that is a reality. And that reality generally picks either the worst or the funniest or both times to stick its head up and point out all the places where your glorious abstract tower of ideas leaks like a sieve. So with the most tenuous idea of what an idea is, let's talk about why some of them seem to stick around for so long. There's a famous quote from the screenwriter John Rogers, solidarity with the striking workers of the Writers Guild of America, by the way, of whom he was the president at one point. There are two novels that can change a bookish 14-year-old's life: The Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged. One is a childish fantasy that often engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood unable to deal with the real world. The other, of course, involves orcs. I've never read Atlas Shrugged, and I don't really intend to. But this was, in terms of the books that hit me the hardest when I was doing all that worldview development stuff in my younger years, is more of like a book-length zine masquerading as a religious text, masquerading as a joke, masquerading as all of the above. It's called Principia Discordia, or How I Found Goddess and What I Did to Her When I Found Her, which professed itself to be the holy book of a religion-worshipping Eris, the sort of Greek/Roman god of chaos and discord. And this thing blew my mind, mainly because I hadn't discovered postmodernism yet. The main thing I liked about it, though, was it had this sort of relentlessly kind of joyful and irreverent vibe to it, while also feeling very earnest at times, and I can't see why that's relevant to me now. But anyway, one of the passages that stuck with me was a bit where they talked about the difference between reality and our ideas about reality. They define reality as pure chaos, which our minds can't cope with. And so we kind of construct a set of ideas about reality that they call a reality grid. And so we can look at the chaos through that and use it to make sense. We kind of map bits of the chaos to points on the grid. And these grids are often shared, often at a cultural level. They're often also misperceived as being the actual reality itself. And that's part of their explanation for the difficulties of cross-cultural communication. And it was the first time I'd come across this kind of notion, and it just made a lot of sense at the time, and it still does. And thinking about that is part of how I get to this idea that, grids, shapes, we get to the notion of an idea having a shape. So some shapes fit together well, others don't. Sometimes you can overcome the lack of fit by introducing more shapes. Other times you can't. Your tower of abstractions has to be built out of shapes, and the shapes have to fit together well enough that it's stable and doesn't fall over all the time, ideally. So this kind of construct allowed me to kind of express some of the ways that ideas get locked into place. When you're dealing with physical space, you're constrained by things. If you're constructing a building in an urban environment, you're constrained by the shape and the size of the lot that you're building on, or by various regulations or laws or other requirements that pertain to the jurisdiction you're in. Similarly, if you want to change or replace an idea, you can be constrained by the other ideas that have been placed around it, which forces the new idea to have to take on aspects of the old one, either in itself or by the affordances that you've had to make around it. And a great example of this involves CPU design. Digital Equipment Corporation's PDP range of mini-computers weren't the first computers ever made, but the PDP-7 was the system on which Unix was developed originally, and then it got ported to the PDP-11, and on these machines is where we get the beginnings of a little language called C. And The PDP systems are also where you get really good examples of the beginnings of what we have as CPU architecture today, at least in part. They have a CPU, although oftentimes it wasn't integrated into a chip at that point. You've got some memory, you've got various communications buses out to other things. CPU's got some registers and whatnot. But primary storage is in RAM rather than in the registers, so on and so forth. We're talking significantly simpler designs, though. Critically, they're strictly in order. They do one instruction at a time. And they've got no, the RAM is flat. There's no caching, there's no RAM that's here or RAM that you have to talk through someone else to get to or anything like that. It's all just that. And the thing is that this is the environment that C was developed in, and it works well there. And it works great there. If you're talking about C as a low-level language, this is where it is a low-level language. But the thing is, it encodes all of the assumptions and the realities that were present in this system. And namely that instructions are run one after the other and that memory is flat and updates immediately. And those don't hold when your CPU looks like that. That's not even the most recent Intel core. That's, I think, Sunny Cove, which is about 2018, 2019. But the thing is, that's not even the only core in that system. There's multiples of them. You can't find systems these days, unless you're going very small, you can't find systems that only have one core in them anymore. And even within those cores, there's just this cavalcade of execution units that can run things in parallel to make things go faster and to make use of all the tiny little transistors that we can make now. And we have multiple levels of cache to cover for the fact that CPUs got faster, but the RAM interfaces didn't keep up. And all of this has to present the abstraction that it's a PDP. It has to present the illusion that it's an in-order flat memory system so that C doesn't fail. And so you get a huge amount of really impressive magic going on under the hood, managing the cache hierarchy, dynamically reordering instructions so as to keep as much of its resources busy as it can, guessing which way upcoming branches are going to go so that it's not going to be sitting there twiddling its registers. And then reality turns up to point out that how all of these layers of abstraction leak like a sieve in the form of Spectre and Meltdown. This is a logo that someone came up with for Spectre because it's holding a branch. Anyway. Thing is, that wasn't the intended outcome. These things accrete over time. The designers of the PDP were making the best system they knew how to for the time. I mean, they were also trying to come in as being very simple. They didn't even call it a computer at first because their backers didn't want them to, because computer made people think big and expensive and room-sized, whereas they were making simple and desk-sized. And the trouble is that when you start out on something like this, your ideas may be unfettered and free and able to change at will at the start. But the more people who share your ideas and the more fixed they become in the form of physical objects or stuff like that, the harder they are to change. And the further down underneath all of the top level ideas, the harder they are to move. It just gets worse over time. And all of this could be fixed if you were willing to change a bunch of stuff. You could unlock the full potential of the way modern CPUs work, if they weren't spending so much of their time trying to look like a PDP, you would have to have a completely different language or a completely different way of expressing your programs to tackle the fact that they were going to be trying to run sequentially. And Intel tried this. The Itanium, one of the features of it was that it had an instruction set that was explicitly parallel. You told it which instructions could run at the same time. The trouble was that Intel said, and then the compiler will handle that bit. And the compiler said, no, I won't. But you can also look at other architectures out there. Digital signal processors, for example, have a completely different way of programming them, although they do have an assembly language, but you generally can't do as much looping or branching in them. Even recently, the Raspberry Pi RP2040 microcontroller has a programmable I/O unit that has its own little instruction set. And these don't generally use C for programming because it just doesn't make sense there. Modern GPU programming, however, does use C, but it's still very weird and has more in common with almost the older kind of Cray-style supercomputer kinds of things. But either way, when you change things, you have to change a lot of things, and so the things don't tend to change very much. For example, Python started out as an untyped language. Objects knew what type they were, but that type wasn't advertised as part of the variable they were bound to, or variables. And this was almost de rigueur at the time that Python came about. A whole bunch of areas of language design were moving away from the strictness of compiled languages into this glorious, dynamic, elegant, expressive future that was permitted by the fact that computers had gotten fast enough that you could run all your code inside an interpreter or a VM. Java came out only a couple of years after the first release of Python, for example, and Python itself was only about a year after Perl 5, and so all of these kind of dynamic languages were showing up, and a lot of them, well, Python and Perl at least, kind of rejected the notion of types as being kind of slightly irrelevant. As with all hot new ideas, it was just everywhere until it wasn't. But being able to say conclusively what type of thing a variable points at can be useful, but abandoning the way that you did that made it less fiddly, and you were able to write your code faster. It just felt nicer to some ways. But then later on, we discovered there is kind of middle paths you can take through types and no types, mainly things like type inference and just sort of more expressive types. If you want a truly sort of bewildering example of that, Rust's type system is incredible and terrifying at the same time. And so it became somewhat cool to start adding types back into things. And so you see that with things like TypeScript and with the typing mechanisms that got retrofitted into Python 3. But adding types to Python is not just a straightforward thing because they weren't there before. TypeScript had the benefit of starting as effectively a whole new language, even if it was getting transpiled back to a language that looked very similar. Rust is also a whole new language, and so it can do its own thing. In contrast, Python's type hinting is getting retrofitted and got retrofitted in 3.5, and by that point, backwards compatibility was something we did not break. And they were purely optional. And then you've got to contend with the fact that a huge amount of Python code out there just didn't have any of those type hints. And if you want more sort of discussion of that, I can recommend this talk by some guy called Chris Neugebauer. But that's not the biggest problem that Python 3 in itself had. Let's talk about text. You see, Python, along with its peers at the time, was developed in C, mostly on things that were sufficiently Unix that we can call them that, and as such a string is a sequence of characters, hopefully terminated by a null. A character is a byte, and a byte was well and truly 8 bits by that point. 8 bits is plenty, you see, because there are only 26 characters. If you add capitals, there's 52, I guess. And then there's numerals and punctuation and all that kind of stuff. But even when you add those, that's like 100 or so, and you've still got some room for magic control sequences and stuff. So 8 bits is tons, right? But by the time we realized that this was rubbish, which we should have a lot earlier than we did, but we didn't. It was all a bit late. Unix and C's relationships with alternate encodings, especially ones that require more than 1 byte to represent a character, has always been a bit fraught. And a large part of this comes down to an assumed fungibility between a sequence of characters and a sequence of bytes. The only real difference between those two kinds of types in C is that the C library routines that handle strings expect a null at the end, whereas those that handle bytes expect you to tell C how big the buffer is. So many bugs. The problem for Python is that it made this assumption too. Python 2 treats a sequence of characters and a sequence of bytes as the same thing. And while you can convert from one of these to a Unicode string eventually, if you want to, that's entirely optional. And when the decision was made to allow compatibility breaks between Python 2 and Python 3, changing that model from a type that represented both text and bytes with an optional extra type supporting Unicode to a type that only supported bytes that could be converted via an encoding to a type that only represented text. This was one of the reasons why the compatibility break was made. because it wasn't clear that that kind of shift could be made any other way. Incidentally, Python 3 was released in December 2008, which is closer to the founding of Amazon than to today, also to the theatrical release of The Lion King, though not to Python 1.0, but not by much. Anyway, as you can imagine, this whole change caused a bunch of issues. Some of those were simply because everything had changed, and now everyone's cheese had been moved, but some people relied on that equivalence. They baked it into the way that they did it, notably web developers. Because while HTTP, at least up to version 1.1, is made up of things that look like strings, those are defined to be bytes. And on initial release, Python 3 didn't have a bunch of the affordances that made dealing with byte strings easier. And so it just made it really tricky. But I mean, a whole bunch of the other stuff was just a whole bunch of people going, why? Why did you need to do this? Everything worked fine before. For me, why did you need to do that? And I mean, most of those people probably had English as a first language, or at least a close one, because the reason why you needed to do that is the alternative is giving a huge amount of preference to languages whose character set fits in ASCII, i.e. English. And making all text by definition a Unicode string meant that now a string in Python meant any string of any text. If nothing else, it makes an explicit distinction between bytes and text. And that kind of explicitness is far more Pythonic than the implicit distinction that was there before. And the pushback against this is one of the reasons that Python 3 took a long time to get moving. Like Python 3.5, I think, is when the motion really started to take hold in terms of moving away from Python 2. And for a lot of time, there was a lot of talk that Python wouldn't survive the transition. And I think that if it wasn't for the community that we have around Python, like conferences like this, and also the happy accident of the scientific community picking up Python and running with it, Python may have been where Perl and Ruby are now, which is, while they're still used and they've still got communities around them, you don't see a lot of new projects, or at least not a lot of visible new projects getting started in them. But I'm really glad that Python did survive, primarily because of the community around it, like this community. But as this kind of points out, when you've got, for the C and CPU examples, you've got these two things that sort of lock together and make either of them hard to move. And then the Python 3 example is very much showing you that when you do try to move them, it all gets a bit fraught. And so the shapes of these things locking together just makes everything hard to change. But with that, now for a brief tangent. In 1994, I joined a choir. What you need to know about me at the time, this is the Flinders University Choral Society. We wore orange t-shirts by choice. And our acronym is deliberate. I'll let you work that one out yourself. But what you needed to know about me at the time is that I was socially awkward. I was very socially awkward. What I probably needed to know about me at the time is that I was neurodivergent, but that's in the past. Anyway, I was confronted with this group of people who were just wonderfully accepting, very noisy, very fun, very open about a bunch of things, lots of fun to be around, but I had no idea at all how to integrate with them, or even how to start. And so I approached it in a way that now I realize is exactly the same way that I approach learning new systems or debugging them. I just sat back and I watched it. And I watched how they interacted with each other. I learned the songs that we sang at the pub after rehearsal. I watched how in-jokes played out. Even though I didn't understand it, I just worked out sort of the calls and the responses. I memorized bits of lore and history that I heard people talking about, and eventually I had enough of that in my head that I felt confident taking part in it myself. riffing on it at times, combining bits and pieces in ways that seemed funny. And I did that so effectively that people have told me that they thought I'd been around for even longer than I had been, because I just seemed to fit in so well. And this whole experience was just vital to how I developed as a social person. I wouldn't be up here talking like this in this kind of environment without that. And so much of my sense of humor and my way of interacting with people is based on having far too much vaguely relevant social context stored in my head that I can make quick connections between things and find something funny or interesting in there and just get it out there quickly. So it pisses me off to no end that AI is going to steal my job. AI is interesting. Interesting in the sense that I'm fascinated by the technology and the mechanics and the thought going into it, but appalled at the way that a lot of people seem to want to use it. It also ties back into the general sort of gist of the shapes of ideas that I was talking to, but in a slightly different way. The main type of AI that we refer to at the moment is some form of trained neural network model. I will flag here, I do not know what I'm talking about. This means that what it's doing is using a prompt to generate a starting condition and then repeatedly selecting a next token, in ChatGPT's case a word, to put next. And this is where the snarky description of spicy autocorrect comes in. It's very much a growth of the same idea as the Markov chain bots that we used to have all over Twitter, all of the ebooks accounts. Back when bots were a thing on Twitter, and back when Twitter was a rest in peace, hellish bird site. But to generate this, they need a lot of content. And so you just have to shovel as much content as you can into them, and then they build up a model of what words follow what other words in a given context. And the main distinction is that the Markov model works purely on working out the frequency of which word follows which other word, whereas these are significantly more complex. The bits that I find interesting personally are sort of the design and the mechanics of training the models and the technical aspects of making it usable, the API aspects of it. But the less cool bits, like the gathering of the content to feed them, and sort of the ways in which a lot of companies are saying, oh, all that content that you are generating, that's ours now and we have a perpetual license to it, or they just go out and take it. That's stuff that other people have covered really well, and so I'm not going to go too far into that in this one. But I will say that if your business idea requires people giving you things for free, or worse, you just taking them, whether that be content or labor or anything, so that you can then profit from it, your business idea kind of sucks. But I do have one excellent AI business idea. There's a story that did the rounds several years ago where a company decided to try and improve hiring. And what they did is they fed all of the CVs into a model along with the hiring outcomes. And this would make them hire better people, right? Is anyone shocked that it turned out to be sexist and racist? My pitch is to lean into that, though. If you think that there's bias in your system, we'll train a model on it and show you how biased it is, so that you can then go, oh, we're that sexist. If anyone wants to do this, talk to me after. My idea, can't have it. But anyway, and it brings me back to the topic at hand. Bias is a representation of one of these kinds of ideas. It's been lodged somewhere, and dealing with that requires self-evaluation. We're familiar with the notion of things being, familiar. We get used to things. They become part of the scenery, part of a routine. Even annoying things can become just something we deal with, like init systems. Ideas do the same kind of thing if they're left alone for too long. They can become assumptions or even beliefs. And those things can be dangerous, especially if you forget or you don't realize that they're there. One of my issues with these AI models is they can't introspect. They can't evaluate themselves. Content goes in, gets turned into a thing from which content can emerge, but the ability of that system to understand why it made that content is not there. Not only that, it doesn't know if the content, either the content that it generated or the content that it's using is good for any of multiple definitions of good. Hence all the effort that they have to put into it, making guardrails around what they'll output, and all of the hilarious, my grandmother worked in a napalm factory ways that they use to get around it. Being able to evaluate the worth or the value or the goodness of our ideas is critical, and our assumptions, because and we even need to be able to reevaluate what our idea of worth is, or goodness, because those ideas are forming part of the broader sort of geometry and topography that influences what other ideas that we'll accept or find value in. Lacking that ability is what makes these AI systems unable to produce anything truly new, except in as much as they're constructing new things from the dismembered parts of other things. But I think I can sense someone thinking very loudly that they've come up with the perfect well actually for later on. Didn't AI just make a new sorting algorithm? And it did, but not that kind of model. This kind of model there might be some of that large language model generative stuff going on under the hood, but it's got the particular model that they're using for this one, which is the same one that they use to play Go and StarCraft and several other things. It has a notion of what good is for it. It knows in this case that it's been given a list of unsorted items, and the thing that it makes has to turn that into a sorted list, and that taking less time or fewer instructions to do that is better. And so, it's a very simplistic definition of what good is, though. And the thing that really worries me is that when or if AI gets used in the development of policy or law, or hell, even the next Marvel movie, who gets to define what's good? Because you and I can re-examine our ideas. We can look at these things and say, hang on, this one isn't working for me anymore. And if not outright discard it, we can at least sort of flag it as saying, not this one anymore, or something like that. And, we get, sorry. And if we don't do this, it's dangerous, because we can end up with these ideas that stick around for too long. And those ones can be at a personal level, or they can be at a societal level, which can be even more pernicious. And just so many people can end up assuming that these ideas are immutable, that they are, for lack of anything else, they are. And as with all the ideas, these ideas have a shape, and that shape has an effect on the kinds of ideas that we can put with them. I mean, going back and digging through all of the things in your head can be confronting as hell, but it can be really important. In my case, it was looking at the stories of a bunch of my friends that they were telling about their experience of discovering that they weren't neurotypical, and realizing that they mapped far too well onto what I thought was just a form of laziness or distractedness on my part. For other people, it might be a realization that no matter how hard they try, they just don't fit into the gender they were born with. Or even just a realization that they're in the wrong career. All of these things are ideas with shapes that have been built up around them, and changing them can be massively disruptive. But that's not the only thing that can go wrong if we fail to sort of examine the foundational ideas that are around us. And because you can end up taking them for granted. We get used to things. We get used to being able to get what we need when we need it from the supermarket. We get used to being able to get together every year for conferences. We get used to a whole lot of these things, and then it stops. One of the most fascinating things about how the pandemic affected society was just the exposure of how much of it had come to rely on global logistics. Not only had a lot of manufacturing moved offshore, but companies had become so allergic to keeping stock on hand, both for reasons of not wanting to be exposed to inventory that might become hard to sell, or because they didn't want to pay for the space to store it, that they were just existentially dependent on the ability to move things around. And when that stopped working, they were just stuffed. You couldn't get tinned tomatoes, not because of a lack of tomatoes, but because of a lack of tins. Industry had assumed that global logistics was something that couldn't fail because up till now it never had. And then, like a container ship getting wedged in a canal, reality came along and pantsed them. But there was an odd positive to this kind of things changing as well. We suddenly discovered that social welfare was something we could actually do. I mean, we probably forgot it again, or at least anyone involved in it tried to, and absolutely don't remind the Labor Party that we could do that. But in general, you know, there's this nasty sense in the capital classes that we're in the end game of a particularly nasty round of Jenga, where they keep trying and often succeeding in knocking out parts that they don't think that we need anymore, because they prevent them from hoarding more and more resources and they just assume that the whole edifice isn't going to collapse, or that if it does, that they've got enough resources that'll insulate them from a result. I'd like to hope that we can reverse this, but we have to face our own assumptions that these things can't or won't change. And I'm thinking very loudly at the Australian Labor Party, but we'll get back to them in a sec. Because I've got one more bit to go through. So another thing that we can show using the whole kind of notion of ideas as shapes is the way that the same idea or similar ideas can show up in multiple places independently. There are some shapes that are very similar, and you can also have shapes that end up constructing themselves and leaving a similarly shaped gap, and at that point a similarly shaped idea can slot in there. And you know, that's somewhat an obvious thought, but I think there's a couple of things that can be drawn out of it. The first one that is talking about when you decide to burn everything down. Deciding that something is not or is no longer fit for purpose and just having the ability or the resources to yeet the thing feels great. Until you're standing among the rubble of the thing you just demolished, and then you realize you have to start building its replacement. Because all of the ideas that influence the thing you just, torched are still there. And they have the potential to influence what you build to replace it. That may not be a problem. Sometimes just, taking something out and fixing the internal plumbing and putting it back is, worthwhile in and of itself. But there's a lot of cases where, in like socio-political revolutions have happened and entire, systems have been knocked over and then replaced by the exact same thing but with different people at the top. If you want more examples of that, there's an entire podcast about it. Really worth listening to. Even if you don't listen to all of it, the first part of the last season gives one of the best explainers of Marx and Marxism I've ever come across. But there's a more pernicious form of this kind of parallel construction, though, and it's where someone helps you construct, or indeed obstruct, the space for an idea to form, often without you realizing it. And both forms are endemic, especially in the media, but I'm going to talk about the obstructive form of it first, using the language of information security. Let's say you have an idea. An idea can be a complicated thing, and especially communicating that idea can be tricky. The way we tend to deal with this is that we give it a name. And after we've explained it once, we don't have to explain it again. We can just give you the name and you'll know what I'm talking about. The trouble is that when the idea becomes more widespread, especially within a group, people start using the name assuming that people know the detail behind it. And I suspect that anyone with any kind of exposure to offensive infosec practice is starting to see where this might be going, because yes, we just made a pointer. And in the head of anyone who hasn't been given the full detail of what we're talking about, we've got a dangling pointer. And them's be dangerous, especially in an environment where you're constantly having to evaluate potentially malicious inputs. This also tends to look a bit like a DNS cache poisoning attack. Where an attacker tries to plant incorrect records into, for example, a DNS resolver, so that when you go to a given website, you end up going to the attacker-controlled version instead. And the human space equivalent goes a bit like this. Socio-political ideas are both nuanced, detailed, and often contentious. And let's say, for example, that you feel that successive waves of austerity-driven cuts to social services have engendered an over-reliance on police forces as a kind of universal first responders, despite the fact that not only do they often not have the right training to deal with a lot of the situations in which you need a first responder, but they also have well-documented biases against certain sectors of the population that lead to not great outcomes. Let's say you're incensed that the police budgets at best seem to be quarantined from these cuts, and at worst seem to be hoovering up all the money that used to support a much broader set of social supports. You might advocate to, for argument's sake, divert police funding to social services, or you might decide to make it even shorter and just say defund the police. Which is a great pithy name for a thing. It chants well, good on signs. But the trouble is that a whole bunch of chuckleheads with columns or TV shows or YouTube channels or Twitter accounts or whatever, X account, will say what you really meant is that we should just get rid of the police entirely. We should not have that kind of law enforcement arm. That must mean you're a criminal or you love criminals or something like that. But the critical idea here is that that idea with that name is now in a whole bunch of people's heads, and so you can't use that name anymore without not only having to explain all of the detail behind it, but also defending yourself from, but doesn't that make you a criminal? And this gets used over and over again. Black Lives Matter is racist, don't you know? Trans people want more rights than everyone else, don't you know? And unfortunately, the only way that I know to get around this is to actually give people the detailed version of what's behind this. And in a lot of cases, these people just don't have enough of the context. And now I'm going to do the bit of this talk I really don't like very much. Let's say you've not met many people from Adelaide. You've got no idea what Adelaideans are. You're a bit suspicious of them, though. Maybe you're from Sydney or something, I don't know. You hear they drink a lot of wine for some reason. They've got way too many churches. They worship these weird balls. And then you're on YouTube one day and the algorithm coughs up a video to you on the Adelaidean agenda. Some person in a well-lit studio with a very expensive-looking microphone, but a very kind of, I'm just a regular person kind of vibe, tells you to like, share, subscribe, don't forget to hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. But did you know that all Adelaideans are serial killers? They love the stuff. They just do it all the time. They want to make it normal. They want everyone to do it. The woke left just won't let us say this anymore. We have to put a stop to it. I used to be a lefty, but now I vote for Peter Dutton. It's not that I like him, you see, it's just that it's worth accepting some of this other stuff that he does as long as we can deal with the Adelaidean menace. I'm really sorry to anyone who's been on the receiving end of anything like that. That is the culture war stuff I was warning about. And it's superficially funny when you do it like that, but it's the exact playbook run by so many people with platforms, from columnists and editors at newspapers to cross-media paleoliths like most of Sky News, to YouTube grifters and everyone in between. It's designed to encourage people, especially those with pre-existing concerns, whether they're reasonable or not, to start their journey down the path to radicalization by taking those concerns and building on them with lies and half-truths. There's multiple tragedies here. One is that these people don't need to go too far down that path to get to the point where they will, at the very least, stand by, while those who are far more committed to this plan do the nastier work. Another is that if they talk to someone else about their concerns first, then those concerns might have been allayed. Instead, they get used as a foundation upon which other ideas are built, and it can be really hard to get at those foundational ideas again to get them out. And the biggest tragedy here is that it means they either have or have been taught a tendency to view certain groups as less worthy or less human based on who they are. It may be a bit simplistic, but there's at least an axis along which a given aspect of someone is who they are versus what they do. They are a man, but they do programming. They are cisgender, but they do big, thinky opinion piece rants. At least in my worldview, it's okay to judge people for their actions, especially when it's clear that those actions were by their own choice. It's not fair to judge people based purely on who they are or are not. And all of these groups are encouraging you to judge people based on who they are. They'll find one or two stories that show someone who they can claim as a member of that group doing something bad and try to use that to construct ideas in people's heads that encourage them to see everyone in that group as somehow bad or wrong. And the despondency that this generates can lead us to forget that progress has been made. Things now, at least when it comes to the rights of people who aren't at the centre of white patriarchy, are better than they were when I was a kid. But all of that progress is one of those things that we can get used to and forget that it's there and that it needs to be defended and pushed further. And that means we need to bring as many of these people on side as we can, even if that means trying to figure out how to break them away from the bad ideas that they've become stuck in. Which leads me to another one of these ideas with a neat name but a malleable concept. Meet them where they live. Most of the people who use this phrase use it to mean more centrism, please. They say that there exists a body of people who are turned off by the constant debate, and especially by the implied strident demands of the woke left or anything like that. And in their formulation, the way to re-engage them is that we should stop demanding respect and rights for these people and focus purely on things like economics. But I say we steal that name, because I think the way that we need to meet people where they live is to go to them and treat them as humans rather than demographics. These people have their own concerns and may indeed be turned off by the strident nature of socio-political debate, when all it is to them is abstract things. I have to believe that these people can be reached, though, and in the same way that it's a win for the regressive types to merely get people to tune out and sit things out, it's a win for us to purely get them to care. To see all humans as humans, even the ones they might find challenging to handle. And this, to me, is one of the great failures of the traditional notionally progressive political parties. Labour, the Democrats in the US, so on and so forth, they've got so used to campaigning by demographics and the tools that they're used in that they've mistaken the abstraction, the idea, for reality. They're so locked into not only the shapes within their own organisations, but they've locked themselves into a way of thinking about their role in society and their ability to affect change that's drifting further and further from the reality of what society actually wants. And at some point, reality is, figuratively, going to punch them in the face. Thank you.
Benno, that was fantastic. Thank you so, so much for coming today and sharing all of that with us. And I will look forward to watching that again and sharing it with everybody else as well, because I think it was very needed. So thank you. And thank you on behalf of the event.
Thank you very much.
Benno Rice.